out where they come together and what they mean, and when in fact something like reasonable doubt, something like lack of criminal responsibility, what that means in terms of the actual medical reference for it, what constitutes it, what is the causal relationship, the nexus between certain psychiatric realities and the different legal standards that we have to prove. In this particular case, you will hear from him, as you will hear from the judge when he instructs you, that we are using the defense of lack of criminal responsibility. It is a defense position, as you heard when we first started talking a long time ago, that Edwin Alemany, at the time of the offense conduct in this case, could not appreciate and substantially appreciate the difference between right and wrong, and he could not substantially appreciate and conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. Dr. Ablo is going to go through a lot of information that's been compiled in this case by the Commonwealth and ourselves, subpoenaing information. You are going to hear that there has been, as you have to some extent heard a bit in cross-examination, you will hear that this particular defendant has a long history of serious mental illness. You will hear the term psychosis. Dr. Ablo will explain to you what psychosis is. He'll explain to you what major mental illness is. He will talk to you about the diagnoses that this gentleman has had since his early teens. He will talk to you about the influences in his life and the trauma that occurred to him that helped serve as the reason for a lot of the mental illness he probably later became afflicted with. You will hear that the different mental illnesses he had resulted in many psychiatric hospitalizations. You will hear that at Bournemouth Hospital alone, which is a psychiatric facility in Massachusetts, he had 6 hospitalizations. You will hear he had 3 at Westwood Lodge, another. You will hear about all the different psychiatric hospitals he went to, all the diagnoses he had. What the diagnoses have in common is that they are serious mental illness. There is something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's called the DSM. We're into the 5th edition of it. He's going to talk to you about that. That's the Bible for forensic psychiatrists. He will tell you that it is formulated around what's called a multi-axial model. Multi-axial model, axis 1 through 5, that talk about different kinds of mental illnesses. He's going to talk to you about which each each axis, what that means, how that relates to the seriousness of a particular mental illness, and how that ultimately relates to the question in this case for us, and ultimately I think for you as jurors, as to whether Mr. Alemany was suffering from mental disease, was suffering from mental defect, and as a result of that mental defect, committed the offense conduct here. That's what I told you when we chose you, and that's what I'm telling you today. You will also hear that apart from the long history of psychiatric hospitalizations and treatments, you will hear that he has a long criminal history interspersed with that. You will also hear that in the different hospitals, he was given a huge amount of what's called psychoactive medication, the kind of medication that's some of them are antipsychotic in nature, some of them are antidepressant in nature, some of them essentially are mood stabilizers. But the bottom line for it all is they are serious medications that are given to serious illnesses and people who are suffering from those serious illnesses. You will hear evidence that we did not invent this client for this case, that he has a very long history of serious trauma, psychiatric disability. You will hear evidence that his life essentially has no real structure to it. As you heard the other day in a little bit of cross-examination, he doesn't really have a home, he doesn't really have a job, and he is very unstable. You will hear Dr. Ablo talk to you about the effect of the multiple hospitalizations, the reasons for them, the effect of the incredibly powerful medications he's been getting, and how that all affects the central question in this case, which is in July 23rd, 24th of 2013, whether he had the ability, whether he had the capacity, as it were, the capacity to in fact, incur responsibility for any acts he took. You will also hear that apart from that particular model, that if you find that as a result of either his underlying mental illnesses that you're going to hear about, or from alcohol consumption, that you may, if you choose, and the judge will instruct you, you may find him guilty of a lesser crime, from first degree to second degree, or under certain circumstances even second degree to manslaughter, if you find that for whatever the reason he did have criminal capacity, but his capacity was diminished. The judge will talk to you about lesser crimes that are available as well. And with regard to alcohol, you will hear that the voluntary consumption of alcohol is not a defense in a case. Under certain circumstances, it can affect a reduction from first degree to second degree, but it can't be a defense that helps a criminal responsibility case, except in situations where there's an underlying psychopathology and the drinking itself was essentially a self-medication that when the psychoactive meds he was taking weren't working or weren't working enough, or he wasn't getting the psychoactive meds, that he was drinking to try to ease his pain, ease the torture that he was in on a pretty regular basis. I think you got just a small piece of that the other day when you saw that tape, and the evidence indicates that if you believe if you believe, as I think one of the police officers suggested, and I don't want to get into this now, but if you believe that the evidence we're going to show you does not indicate somebody who has been troubled for a long period of time, as we suggest it will, that he is somebody with an incredibly long history of mental illness that he's self-medicated for with alcohol. You'll also hear evidence about alcohol. You'll hear that in and of itself that alcohol can be a neurotoxin. It can destroy brains. It can destroy brain cells. And in particular, you will hear evidence that the neurotoxic effect of alcohol affects the higher cortical aspects and functions of the brain, among which is memory, empathy, and impulse control. And you will hear evidence from Dr. Abel that says that only exacerbates his already existing independent psychiatric condition, which we are suggesting to you, in fact, has created a situation where he was simply not criminally responsible. Okay, that's the evidence you expect to get in this case. Within a day or two, I will be standing here arguing to you after you've heard Dr. Abloh, after you've heard presumably anyone that the Commonwealth is going to be calling as a rebuttal to Dr. Abloh. What I ask you to do is keep an open mind, please. You're going to hear evidence from us. You can hear evidence from them. The judges, you can hear argument from both sides. The judge is going to instruct you. Please just keep an open mind until the end of this case. Give us an opportunity to get it all out. Give us an opportunity to argue to you, and then make up your minds. Thank you. Your Honor, we would call Dr. Abloh, Dr. Keith Abloh. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Well, I am trying to line myself up here. Do you think you could state your name for this court and spell it out?
Sure. Dr. Keith Ablow, KeithAblow.
And Dr. Abloh, who are you?
I am a forensic psychiatrist here to provide expert testimony.
And how is it that you were here to do that?
Well, I was requested to do so by Mr. Alemany's defense counsel, including yourself, sir, and come to this work from my educational background, having graduated with a degree in neurosciences from Brown and then going on to medical school at Johns Hopkins and having done a residency at Tufts New England Medical Centers, and then becoming, as you noted, board certified in adult, adolescent, and forensic psychiatry.
And sir, when did you get your board certifications? Were they at the same time or different times?
They were at different times. My adult and adolescent board certification in psychiatry came around 1988, and my forensic psychiatry board certification followed perhaps 4 years later.
And you say you're board certified, sir, in forensic psychiatry, correct?
Correct.
You were in here and you heard my opening to the jury, all right?
Yes.
When I use the term forensic psychiatry, what does that mean to you?
I understand it, as others might, as anything at the interface of psychiatry and the law. And so it's bringing specialized knowledge to that interface so that we can understand things that come up in the law from a psychological perspective or through a psychological lens.
And have you done this before in a court of law?
I have.
And approximately how many times?
Dozens of times, perhaps as many as 100 times.
And have they been in courts in Massachusetts?
Courts in Massachusetts and courts in other states.
Have they been state courts or federal courts?
Both.
And what percentage of your practice, what percentage of your overall practice of psychiatry will you consider to be forensic in nature?
Probably about 30% of my overall practice of psychiatry is forensic in nature.
And what would the other 70% be?
The other 70% would be treating people, adolescents and adults, with any range of psychiatric disorders.
And how much of your professional work time is actually taken up by the practice of psychiatry versus other endeavors?
2/3 to 3/4 of my time is spent in the practice of psychiatry or as an expert witness in psychiatry. So that would be the total, 2/3 to 3/4 of my time.
And the remainder?
I write books, some for the general public, some for the profession. I have work that I do for the media explaining psychiatry to the public, and that would be about it.
And of your forensic practice of psychiatry, how much of that would be criminal and how much would be civil?
Probably half of the work I do is on criminal cases and half is on civil matters.
And with regard to the criminal matters, what percentage of them would you say is done on behalf of the government, prosecution, and what percent on behalf of the defense?
All of my testimony in criminal matters has been on the behalf of defense attorneys.
And in civil matters?
And in civil matters, it's much more about 65% for defendants and 35%, well, it's probably more about 50% and 50% for defendants, and then for complainants or people who have an issue with an insurance company or something like that. So it's split.
And sir, again, tell this jury what you were asked to do by the defense in this case.
So what I was asked to do by the defense counsel in this case is to examine Mr. Alemany, to review any records relevant to the crimes that he's alleged to have committed, including medical records, but also other documents that are part of this legal case, legal documents, depositions, grand jury minutes, many other documents, and through the sum of that information, to render an opinion after talking to Mr. Alemany and talking to relatives of his and reviewing those records, to give an opinion as to whether he lacked criminal responsibility at the time of the crimes he's alleged to have committed.
And do you recall whom you spoke to relative to learning about what happened in this case and about Mr. Alemany generally?
Well, first, I spoke with Mr. Alemany himself for a total of about 4 hours.
On how many different occasions, sir?
On 2 occasions.
And where would that have occurred?
Well, he was incarcerated at 2 separate facilities. I also spoke, as you know, with you and your co-counsel in order to learn more about the case. I reviewed thousands of pages of records, medical records, grand jury minutes, watch relevant videos, listen to relevant audio tapes or recordings, audio recordings. And I also spoke with people who know Mr. Alemany, his mom, his brother, and his brother's partner.
Just to jump ahead for a second, you heard me make some reference to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, sir?
Yeah, I actually brought one, so it's right here.
Okay, could you explain to the jury what the significance of the DSM is?
So the DSM-5, which means the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is like a dictionary of psychiatry, and it has over 300 diagnoses in it that are broken down by symptoms and signs. So that doctors, when they're working with patients, can say, well, I think it's major depression, or I think it's schizoaffective disorder, or no, it's really seems more like something else. And so it's a very extensive list, and it's used by doctors to organize their thinking about patients, but it's also relied upon by insurance companies, for instance, that when you might go to a mental health professional and seek to have an invoice reimbursed by an insurance company, they'll want to know, well, what was it for? And the answer comes out of this book, in part because it has to, even though people are more complicated than this book, and you can't really label people pristinely because everyone's a little different. But many forces in psychiatry sort of drive us to use this book to pick labels.
So when you say labels, what you're suggesting is sort of that book is kind of laid out in different categories of mental illness?
It's laid out in this way. First, there are major mental illnesses, things like depression, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, alcohol dependence. Those are called Axis 1 disorders. They're what are called major mental illnesses. Then there's, or Axis 1 disorders. Don't want to get too much into the weeds. Axis 1 disorders. Secondly, there are these personality disorders, or Axis 2 disorders. They can be very debilitating too, because if anyone knows someone who's suffered with borderline personality disorder, where people cut themselves, have these intense, unstable relationships, use a lot of drugs, may threaten to take their lives dozens of times. Borderline personality disorder is an Axis 2 personality disorder, but very serious and can be, a calamity in terms of that individual's life. So there are these personality disorders that come afterwards. And then, of course, when we're organizing our thinking, it's not in the book, but Axis 3 disorders are medical disorders. So when you're describing a patient for an insurance company, or in a legal context to some extent, you would list Axis 1, does this person have any major mental illnesses? Axis 2, does he have any personality disorders? And Axis 3 would be, how about medical conditions?
And sir, where does the notion of psychosis come into the multi-axial model?
Well, psychosis is a symptom. So psychosis can be found in many diagnoses. There are people who are so depressed, for instance, that they hear voices telling them they're terrible people. Literally hear voices the way you're hearing mine. There are people who suffer with schizophrenia who believe that the CIA is following them. That's also psychosis. That's called a delusion. The first is called an auditory hallucination, a voice.
It may be a delusion.
It may be a delusion, we would hope. There are folks who see visions because they're impaired by severe dependence on drugs, and they're seeing things that aren't there. Then other conditions can cause that too. So psychosis can be present in many conditions. It's a very, very serious psychiatric symptom, but it's not a diagnosis, it's a symptom.
And when you say it's a symptom, does it, as a symptomatology, does it comprehend some level of a certain kind of relationship to reality?
Well, psychosis is in fact well defined as the absence of reality. So it's things that aren't there. You hear a voice, but there's no one talking. And this is not like a thought in your mind. This is a voice. Or you see a vision, but it's not really there, or you have an idea, but it's objectively clearly not true, but you believe it, an unshakable, fixed, and false belief.
So you may subjectively believe it, but it's not objectively validatable?
If it's so clearly not objectively validatable and such a product of an underlying mental illness, we would call that psychosis.
And you heard me refer to a long history of major mental illness for Mr. Alemany, did you not?
I did.
And have you had an opportunity to study the history of mental illness that he has, yes or no?
I have.
Okay. Your Honor, I might approach the witness? Dr. Alba, I'm showing you a document entitled Hospitalizations and Psychiatric Treatment. Would you please, it's a 3-page document, could you review that for a moment?
Sure. Okay.
You've seen that before, yes?
I have.
Is that a fair and accurate representation, a summary chart, as it were, of the history of this defendant's psychiatric hospitalizations, yes or no?
I believe it to be.
Is there anything that you feel is inaccurate on that?
It may not be exhaustive in terms of the medications used and some of the diagnoses proffered, but it looks to be nearly complete.
Okay. Your Honor, I move to have that admitted as an exhibit. I gave it to you before.
I have it.
Your Honor, I have subject. Sorry.
Exhibit 311, so marked.
Thank you. Your Honor, subject, of course, to your decision, I think it might be helpful if I could publish it to the jury and perhaps give them each one a copy. There's a better way to do this. There's 6, I'll give you the 9. I think it's just that'll work too. Do you have enough? Okay, where's it? Sir, simply answering yes or no at this moment, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the defendant, on or about July 23rd of 2013, July 24th of 2013, was suffering from a major mental illness, yes or no?
I do.
And as is part of the opinion that you have reached based upon your assessment and evaluation of his medical history?
It is.
And the medical records that you have reviewed?
Yes.
Sir, let me ask you, can you please describe to the jury the beginnings of that medical history?
Yes. The beginning of the medical or psychiatric history takes us back to really Mr. Alemany's earliest years when he was born to a woman diagnosed with schizophrenia. Mr. Alemany was known to be suffering with something that made him, even in his early school years, inattentive and a troubled student. But certainly by age 12, his schooling was complicated. So in his middle school, he needed an individualized educational program in order to try to cope with lots of symptoms that he was showing.
Needs legislation that exists in Massachusetts?
Correct. So as part of the special needs legislation in Massachusetts, teachers tried to help Mr. Alemany to learn, but they needed a special plan. Even with that, they noted that Mr. Alemany's moods would shift dramatically from time to time without any connection to events that took place in the classroom. So he might be very angry at one time, seemingly content at another. They noted that he would wander. He would just walk off. even leave the classroom and be found in the hallway, and when asked, "What are you doing?" he would say, I don't know, what do you mean?" So they found it very difficult to redirect him during that time. From my perspective, what they weren't focused on yet is that Mr. Alemany was laboring under multiple psychiatric illnesses and had had events in his life that were also quite traumatizing.
When you say that they hadn't focused on it yet, understand that he was born in 1984, September.
Correct.
What time period are we talking about right now?
Right now we're talking about 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade. So no doubt there were signs and symptoms earlier than that, but I don't have access to the records. In any case, by that time, he was showing signs of impairment. One of the reasons that he might have been showing signs of impairment is he was also at that time being victimized, traumatized by being sexually abused by a friend's adult male in the home. He doesn't recall at this point whether that was a much older brother, an uncle, or a boyfriend of his friend's
And
mom.
may I ask you, sir, when you learned of this in your conversations with him?
Yes, I learned of this on December 29th, 2014, when I visited Mr. Alemany in jail. Yes. At age 12, Mr. Alemany began experiencing this sexual abuse, which went on for at least a year, and perhaps longer. Whenever he would find himself in the company of his friend, he would try to avoid this gentleman who was over there, but he wasn't very good at avoiding this gentleman, and he was both forced to perform oral sex and have anal sex, as well as have oral sex performed on him.
And he disclosed this to you?
He did.
And do you have any reason to believe that that's true?
Well, I have reason to believe that it could be true, number one, because he reports it. And he reports it not willingly initially and presenting it to me in a way that I'd say, wow, well, you seem to be offering this in such a pat manner. I needed to ask him again and again and again whether there might be something that he found traumatic that he hasn't shared with anyone in his past, things that might be embarrassing to him. And when he revealed it, after long questioning, he did so by breaking down, weeping uncontrollably, and not wanting to talk about it anymore. So, as a psychiatrist, having interviewed a lot of people, some of whom make things up, it seemed to me that this seemed credible because of the groundswell of emotion that he expressed it with, and the fact that he wasn't looking to tell me about it. He was attempting to not tell me about it.
And did you ever have any further discussions about this subject with him? Was he willing to talk?
In a very limited way. I got more information from him on our second visit, which took place March 5th of 2015, because in the first instance he wasn't really willing to describe exactly what had happened. He was minimizing a bit more trust, or because there'd been a little bit more time, he was able to, and I say just in quotes because it's traumatizing enough, was it just an oral sex situation? But no, it was more than that even. And again, related to me with great emotion.
And can you describe how, in your opinion, that fits into the progression of his own mental health over time?
Well, I was here for your statement, and you alluded to explaining not only what, but why. And we know the what of the alleged crimes. We also will find out as I speak more, well, what are the illnesses? But there's a why to psychiatric illness too. Well, why? at least in my experience, because I worked with a lot of people, and they go through things, and then sometimes illnesses manifest as a result. We know he has a genetic component because his mom suffered with a severe psychiatric illness. But in addition, he has a traumatic past that includes not just this, but this is a big thing at 12 years old, that he tried very hard to not focus on what was happening, he tells me. And one of the ways, and it's a little disarming, and I think people can empathize with it, one of the ways that he tried not to focus on it is while he was being raped, he would try to imagine himself at home using his PlayStation. And then when it was over, he tried to forget it. And he'd try to just go on and go find his friend and have a play date with his friend. But memories of this intruded at times, and he, again, every time would try not to think of that. So the roots of what I'll explain Mr. Alemany now suffers with were built in some manner or to some extent back then when he trained his mind to not remember, trained his mind not to focus, trained his mind not to be there during stress. And that sets the stage for the kinds of disorders he comes to suffer with. I'm not saying that it's solely responsible for those disorders. I'm saying that when you have the misfortune to have perhaps a weaker genetic legacy because you have people in your family who suffer with illness, mental illness, when other things come into your life, like this trauma, when you try not to think about it, and then when, for instance, another unlucky event, multiple instances of head trauma around that time. So around age 14, Mr. Alemany's rendered unconscious. He's hit in the head. A friend of his throws a brick. He wakes up at the hospital. And we know now that head trauma is linked to impulsivity and irritability. So what we see building here is the unhealthy alliance of a number of different factors. Genetic, life history, then this anatomical head trauma that befalls him, and early on he tries to not think about these events in more than one way. One is he's efforting it, as many of us do. We say, I'm not thinking about that, that's too painful. And then it becomes second nature, so you don't think about it and you bury it unconsciously. But he also, very early on, and most of us thankfully don't have experience with this, resorted to using drugs to not think about it. So by age 13, he's using marijuana and ecstasy and alcohol to not focus on the trauma and the pain and the symptoms, by the way, that are already developing. As noted by his teachers, he's not normal. He's wandering. He's impulsive. His emotions aren't under control. So he's trying at that point, how do I even it out? He's using marijuana, he's using ecstasy, he's using alcohol, and unfortunately, again, right, like a perfect storm, terribly perfect storm, he's not in a home where these things are really being noticed, because we know, I know from talking to his mom, and the court knows from later testimony, that his mother didn't really think that he was terribly disordered, right? Go figure. So
this was his mother that was suffering from schizophrenia?
Yes. So perhaps she didn't notice that her son was wandering away from home back then, that he was as emotionally out of control as he was, that he lacked memory, and the school calls that ADHD. Well, it wasn't attention deficit disorder. It was something much more serious, and now we see the end result of it. And so he doesn't get the help he needs, and by age 15, he's in locked hospitals. He's in locked psychiatric hospitalizations and a ward of the state of DYS.
And how would you describe his alcohol use going forward from his early teens, 13 on, 14, 15 and up?
Mr. Alemany has always gravitated toward and tried to use substances, alcohol, benzodiazepine tranquilizers, ecstasy, marijuana, using more and more of it in an attempt to self-medicate, because these symptoms that he begins having, including hearing voices and seeing visions. By the way, here we see the logical extension of getting away from yourself. You pull yourself away from your life history and your pain, and suddenly you're hearing things that aren't there. You're seeing things that aren't there because you're not really there. And you're not remembering whole periods of your day at times, because his family does say this, well, you know, Edwin would wander. And we'd find him hours or maybe even a day later and say, well, you were supposed to be home for this or that. And he would say, I don't know what you're talking about. I just left. That's called amnesia, and that's a result of one of his diagnoses. But if I can, I could go through a few of the data points in his history.
You just mentioned, did you not, that at an early age, probably around age, I guess, 15, that he began his series of hospitalizations, correct?
Correct.
Would it be helpful to talk about that hospitalization and take us through the subsequent hospitalizations, yes or no?
Yeah, I think it would be, if you have the patience for it.
Would it be instructive for you to talk about what the differential diagnoses were in each hospitalization and the different medications used and so forth and so on?
I believe it would be.
Well, please, what came next?
Okay, so from 1999, you'll see on your handout, some of the things that I mentioned are in my report, which I think the jury receives at some point. But in any case, I'll try to reconcile the two. But on the report, you see that his hospitalizations start in 1999. He was born in 1984, so he's 14 or 15 years old. So he's going to the Charles River Hospital, being taken to tough psychiatric emergency, but we don't have those records. What we have, to some extent, is the Butler Hospital Justice Resource Institute in Westboro records, where he gets all different diagnoses because they're trying to understand what might be to blame. These diagnoses include things like major depression, conduct disorder, attention deficit disorder, but they're already using a host of medicines to try to control it. Antidepressants, psychoactive medications, meaning antipsychotics, which indicates that even at that point, you wouldn't use those if someone weren't either extremely aggressive without a reason for it, or hearing voices or seeing visions. And in fact, the records show by then he already had these auditory hallucinations. And he was
is that a symptom that did or did not persist as he goes forward in his life to young adulthood and adulthood?
It does persist. The only time when these voices are less intense or absent are those times when Mr. Alemany is incarcerated in one place or another. So in the Department of Youth Services, if they're delivering his medicine, things are better. If he's in a hospital, as fragmented as our mental health care system is, there are many, many hospitalizations, but none of them for years, more like weeks. When he's treated with antipsychotic medication, antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, sleep medicines, his symptoms are reduced. But when he's discharged, his symptoms increase unless he's being monitored by the Department of Youth Services or any other agency. And for instance, that's the Butler Center, which I mentioned. But by 1999, again, he's only 15 now, he's hospitalized for the first time at Bournewood Hospital. And he has 6 hospitalizations there. But some of the things I noted in the records include this, and I wrote this in my report. I said by age 15, Mr. Alemany had been admitted to the Locke Psychiatric Unit at Bournewood Hospital with suicidal ideation and homicidal ideation. So at 15, he's already having thoughts of killing himself and killing other people, and psychosis. That's the auditory or visual hallucinations or delusions I talked about. He had threatened to blow up his school. He'd threatened to jump off a bridge. He had scratched his chest and both arms. He had banged his head into walls repeatedly. He'd tried to hang himself This is all in the medical records. He had tried to overdose. He'd already been placed on Depakote, which is a mood stabilizer, like lithium, right, for bipolar disorder. He'd been placed on Wellbutrin, there's a 15, an antidepressant, and he'd been placed on Seroquel, which is an antipsychotic medication. So everybody who sees him agrees, very sick, needs many medicines to control mood and anxiety and to control his perceptions, which aren't real. Then they add trazodone for sleep. That's a sleep medicine. Then they add lithium to try to stabilize his mood. Then they add risperidone, another antipsychotic. And then they use cogentin to try to deal with the side effects of these antipsychotic medications because they can make you feel stiff or shaky. Also at Bournewood, and I wrote it in my report, he reported hearing voices telling him to cut himself and to hurt others. He heard a male voice stating, "You're not worth anything, kill yourself so you don't kill anyone else."
Sir, was that still in the first hospitalization?
It's within the series of hospitalizations.
Okay. Well, if you're not still talking about the first hospitalization, I think you indicated there were 6 hospitalizations at Bournewood.
Yes.
And are you now talking about the sequence of hospitalizations there over time, not necessarily the first one?
Exactly.
Would you make that as clear as you can to the jury as you go forward?
I will, thanks. Yes, I will. He did describe that he was in the habit of cutting himself to discharge his violent impulses and his mood swings. So, again, people find a lot of different ways to try to not think about things that are troubling them. And none of these things, other than really confronting what's bothering you or getting the help you need, is going to work. So he'd already tried not thinking about it. He had tried believing that he was playing PlayStation. He had tried wandering away. You could say that's a coping mechanism. He had tried not remembering at all. He had tried alcohol, marijuana, ecstasy, and now he's cutting. But it's still not enough, because cutting is very distracting. It releases endorphins into your system. It makes you feel, in some ways, energized, so you forget what was really at the root of why you were cutting. But it's still not enough, because he's still distracted by voices and visions and thoughts of killing himself and jumping off bridges and killing other people. And that's just Bournewood. And
do you recall, are you now talking about the whole sequence of Bournewood hospitalizations?
Well, the sequence is this. There was a Bournewood hospitalization you'll see on the first page, June 1999, during which he's diagnosed with cognitive disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, and psychosis. He's then admitted again in December, so June, July, August, September, October, November, December. About 6 months later, second Bournewood hospitalization. Now they note different diagnoses. Oppositional defiant disorder is still there, but now major depression and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Now, the next hospitalization is not at Bournewood, but the first 2 are at age 15, separated by 6 months. That didn't work, obviously, at Bournewood in December of 1999, even though, as I noted, he's placed on a variety of medicines, mood stabilizing, anti-anxiety, antipsychotic. So he's admitted to New England Medical Center.
Would it be fair to say at this point, the Division of Youth Services, the DYS entity in Massachusetts, is making these referrals and determining his future?
Yes, because at DYS he's doing things like suddenly attacking another young person, or threatening to kill someone, or eating paint chips, or running headfirst into walls. And so they're saying, look, this is beyond us. And they precipitate these admissions first to Bournewood, and then New England Medical Center in the very same month is asked to see him, and they come back and they say, well, you know, I know you guys have said oppositional defiant disorder, major depression, ADHD, psychosis, and cognitive disorder. We think it's bipolar disorder. So more medicines, more diagnoses.
What is bipolar disorder?
So bipolar disorder is...
is it an Axis 1 diagnosis?
Yes, in fact, all of these diagnoses are Axis 1 diagnoses. Bipolar disorder refers to the fact that people who get major depression sometimes cycle from major depression, those terrible lows, to the opposite, euphoria, racing thoughts, believing you're Superman. So that's called mania. And when those two things alternate, or both have occurred at various times, we call that bipolar disorder. So he's admitted to New England Medical Center, diagnosis is bipolar disorder. The next year, and only about 6 months later, in April, for a couple months now, he's at Brighton Hospital, and it's a 90 to 120 day commitment, which in our world, in my work, signifies an extraordinary effort to provide services to someone, because even back then, in the year 2000, that would have been long after I finished my training, we were already getting a lot of pushback from hospitals and from insurers saying, well, you should really get people out, let's keep it at 7 days. Lots of people must have worked in order to get him a 90 to 120 day stay at this hospital in Brighton, where they say, okay, we're going to still say oppositional defiant disorder, but also we don't think it's bipolar disorder, we think it's mood disorder not otherwise specified, which gives us a little insight into this book, which doesn't exactly completely describe a person in its 300-word language. So there are 300 diagnoses, but as you can see, lots of people seeing the same person choose different labels for him.
Would it be fair to say that within the universe of affective disorder, and all these diagnoses you're talking about are essentially affective disorders, that there's a huge overlap?
There's a tremendous overlap. As I'll make plain, I think that they were missing another diagnosis that was quite different. But nonetheless, yes, there's overlap. And one of the important things that they're saying here, if you reduce it all down to its molecular structure and try to understand it, is they're saying, look, he can't pay attention to things. We think there's an ADHD thing. He seems to be depressed, but more than that, he has voices and visions. He's not in reality. And in addition to that, there's a cognitive element here. We don't think he understands things just from like an educational level, which we knew before because he wasn't keeping pace with his contemporaries in school. So the hospitalizations go on, and just in June of 2000, they finally discharge him after this 60 to 90 day commitment, which ended up being April to May, May to June, 60 days, but it turns out too soon because his illness has not abated, and he's diagnosed at Bournemouth Hospital for his third hospitalization with major depression with psychotic features.
And when it says psychotic features, what would that... Can I approach sidebar for a moment? Why don't you continue what you were saying, sir?
Sure. I was noting that after the admission to Brighton Hospital, which was so long, 60 days, Bournemouth Hospital still needed to be included again in June, just right after he's discharged. He's still not well, and he's diagnosed with major depression with psychotic features. A date? I'm sorry. Bournewood Hospital, third hospitalization. Oh yes, June of the year 2000. Now, if I can, since we're not necessarily talking about each medicine at each place, I did assemble a list of some of the medicines to give a sense of the breadth of them that end up being used.
Mode simply to focus a bit on what we're doing.
Sure.
It'd be fair to say that in June of 2000, he had his third hospitalization at Bournewood.
Correct.
And that was in close proximity, was it not, to his previous hospitalization, which had ended probably days or weeks so earlier, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And with regard to the Bournewood third hospitalization, sir, were there any diagnoses that you recall were posed by the doctors there?
Yes, he was diagnosed with major depression with psychotic features.
And what does that say to you in terms of what that means for the layman?
What that means is that the doctors felt that his depression was, number one, present. So he's experiencing. So major depression was
I didn't hear your ruling, sir.
Major depression with psychotic features, or a doctor generally who diagnoses such a thing, would mean that someone qualifies for that diagnosis, meaning that they have a very low mood, might have suicidal ideation, might be tearful, may have difficulty concentrating, but when they note with psychotic features, they're again paying homage to or stating that Mr. Alemany's depression at that time is severe enough that he's experiencing hallucinations. So he's hearing voices, and the voices he hears generally are very critical voices, or also ones that tell him to do things, and those are very dangerous hallucinations. They're called command auditory hallucinations, and people often cannot resist command auditory hallucinations because when people are in the throes of hearing voices.
Medications, in fact, were prescribed at that point? Or could you locate it on the record?
Yes. Well, I should say this about that. No. I think because of the range of medicines and the number of hospitalizations, what I deferred to was to create a list of medicines used at hospitals.
And where did you derive this list from?
From the medical records themselves.
That you had reviewed yourself?
Yes. They were so voluminous, and the medicines used were so numerous that at a point I decided I'll make a list of the medicines that have been used to try to treat Mr. Alemany.
And what were some of those medicines, sir?
So among the medicines...
If you could take them one at a time, if you don't mind, and talk about that particular medicine.
Could you try and break this down into some type of relevant time frame?
If you could, are you able to, for example, cite the hospitalization and tell us the meds, or do you just have a list of meds?
Well, I can, but I'm going to have to go to the records themselves.
And take your time. You had.
Let's do this. Why don't you answer the question about the meds you derived from the hospital records and tell us about the meds?
Okay. So, in the rough time frame from 1999 until, say, 2002, or, 1999 to 2002.
And it would be fair to say in 2002 he was 18 years of age and aged out of the DYS context?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. So while he's in DYS, they can't cope with him just in DYS and lockup, or juvie, as my son would say. They are referring him to one locked psychiatric facility after another, but those places seem not to be able to contain this either because they keep referring him to other ones. But the medicines used at those facilities include, but are not limited to, Thorazine.
And why don't you explain to this jury what Thorazine essentially is and what it's generally used for?
So Thorazine is an antipsychotic medication, and there's a theory about psychosis, which is hearing voices, seeing visions, or having these delusions, or other people, by the way, believe they're being touched or that they're smelling things that aren't there. But Thorazine is used as an antipsychotic medication. Some people think it works by blocking dopamine in the brain, and they think that there's too much dopamine in people with schizophrenia, and if you block it, that might contain the symptoms. And Thorazine is helpful to some extent in containing those symptoms. It can also contain aggression. So that's one of the medicines.
And what other medicines are there, sir?
Another that is tried is Depakote. Depakote is actually an anti-seizure medicine, but it's well known that most anti-seizure medicines also work for bipolar disorder. So Depakote is a mood stabilizer. So
that would not be an antipsychotic, that would be an effective
be a mood stabilizer. And very often when Mr. Alemany is in the hospital, he's on 5 or 6 of these medicines at the same time, trying to dial in a way to control him or restore control to him, self-control. In addition to that, he's taking clonidine. Now, clonidine is an antihypertensive medicine. It's for blood pressure, but it's also used in people with attention deficit disorder and impulsivity and aggression, because it turns out if your blood pressure can't get very high and your pulse can't rise too much, you might not haul off and punch someone. And also, if those things are controlled, maybe your attention will stay focused because you're not geared up as much. So it's a blood pressure medicine used for behavioral reasons.
Other medications that you've noted from these hospital records, sir?
Another medicine that he's treated with is lithium. Lithium, many people know this, is used to treat bipolar disorder or severe major depression alone. And it can be very effective. It's in the same class as a mood stabilizer as Depakote. So very often Depakote and lithium are used together to try to contain symptoms of very severe bipolar disorder or severe major depression.
And what other medications did you derive from medical records, sir, between that time period, 97 to 2002?
So much like Thorazine, they try using Seroquel. Seroquel is another antipsychotic medication, like Thorazine.
And after that, sir?
There are antidepressants that are tried. Antidepressants that are tried for Mr. Alemany include Paxil, which is thought to perhaps raise serotonin in the brain. That's a chemical that's thought to be related to feeling good. And if you raise it, the thought is, well, maybe you won't be depressed anymore. So Paxil is one of the antidepressants.
And any other psychoactive medications, sir?
Yes. Another of the antidepressants is Wellbutrin. So he's tried also on Wellbutrin.
And be fair to say that these are all very powerful medications?
Yes, they are. They're all psychoactive medications and among the most powerful ones we have in psychiatry.
Are there any other medications you noted during this time period?
Yes. He's also placed at various times on Ativan, or lorazepam is the generic, which is a little like it is like Valium. It's in the same class as Valium. So to contain anxiety or agitation, another way they try to do that is with Ativan.
Any others, Your Honor? Sir?
Doctor. Sorry. Yes, indeed. Another, later in his course, now we're talking more like, maybe 2004 or so, but he's placed on Geodon. Now the importance of Geodon is that it's a much later version of Thorazine. So it's meant to control visions and voices, but you would resort to it usually when you feel like, oh, the old standbys aren't working. Or if you felt like the side effects were just unbearable of these medicines, because it tends to have fewer side effects.
And Any other notable medicines that...
Well, apparently he can't sleep, so they're using Ambien as one of the ways to help him sleep, which is sleeping medicine. In the same way they're trying trazodone and other sleeping medicine.
Other medications, sir, that you noted from the records?
At least one other, which is that they are using Vistaril, which is an anti-anxiety compound. So they're using Ativan for anxiety and Vistaril for anxiety. They have several antipsychotics. They're trying several medicines for depression. They're trying several medicines for sleep. They're trying.
Is there any significance attributable to the fact of the great multiplicity of medications that were attempted?
I believe so. As a as a psychiatrist who's treated a lot of people in hospital settings and in private practice, and then looked at a lot of charts.
What does it tell you then?
When you look at a list like this, in my opinion, you're seeing people trying to contain symptoms that are unwieldy. So they're making attempts, but the attempts aren't working because they're having to re-hospitalize Mr. Alemany again and again in very short time frames. And the medicines aren't really working very well.
Is he hospitalized again after his third hospitalization at Bournemouth?
He is.
And where would that be, sir?
He's hospitalized next at the Arbor Psychiatric Hospital, another locked psychiatric unit, where in October 2001, when he is then 17, he is diagnosed with major depressive disorder, conduct disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, bipolar disorder, psychosis, antisocial personality disorder, and I'm forgetting what I indicated with ODO, oppositional defiant disorder.
What do all these diagnoses suggest?
Well, one thing they suggest is that Mr. Alemany is suffering with very severe symptoms of a variety of kinds. So he's impulsive and doing things that you wish he wouldn't, like being violent, as in the conduct disorder and the oppositional defiant disorder, where he won't take direction or can't take direction. He's experiencing these voices, visions, and delusions, as noted by the psychosis diagnosis. He is depressed. His mood's down. But more than that, because major depression is more than low mood. It's a real clinical disorder where you can't concentrate and you might not sleep and you may have no appetite and you may think of killing yourself. So that's happening. What it also suggests to me, and we haven't spoken of this, is that they're missing part of the puzzle, that they don't have the right diagnosis, so they can't render the right treatment.
And I know that Westwood Lodge Hospital, I note that the term psychotic features is used again with major depression, sir. Do you have any idea what those psychotic features were from the record?
I do. Give me a moment. Yes, at that time, in Westwood Lodge Hospital.
In March, April of 2002?
Correct. He is he's self-mutilating, so he's scratching his arms or otherwise hurting his body. He's hearing the voices of a male voice telling him to hurt himself or others. He tried to hang himself. He had hallucinations of bugs crawling on him. He also had command auditory hallucinations. These are the most dangerous things you can have in psychiatry because they're insistent voices telling you, you will do this. And these voices are telling him to either kill himself or get other people to kill you.
And after Westwood Lodge at that point, what is the progression of hospitalization, sir, if any?
He's then, we know that he was seen at the Butler Center for Psychiatric Services, but that's all we know. because there aren't records to comb through.
And after Butler?
And then after Butler, he's back to Westwood. And again, just 2 months later, he's back in Westwood Hospital, second hospitalization there.
And were there diagnoses that were suggested by the doctors at that point?
Well, they suggest that he may be suffering with psychosis. That's not a diagnosis, it's a symptom. And they say it's now they're going to call it bipolar disorder with psychotic features, suggesting that the doctors there are now saying, well, it's not just lows, profound lows of mood, it's also that high of the roller coaster called mania, where you're euphoric and you might think you're Superman or even another person.
And are the psychotic features similar or the same psychotic features that were mentioned in his last hospitalization at Westwood Lodge?
Some of the symptoms are the same at that point, yes. They are let's say that they're the same at that point.
And where does he go after, if anywhere, Westwood Lodge Hospital? Where does he go?
Well, after Westwood Lodge Hospital, he goes for his fourth hospitalization at the Bournewood Hospital.
And were the diagnoses that were interposed at that point too?
Oh, can I retrace my steps a bit?
Certainly.
I do have a notation about the second Westwood Lodge admission, during which...
that was in June of 2002?
Correct. Which included him trying to hang himself. So I do have that note. Then on to, as you've noted, Bournewood Hospital, fourth hospitalization.
And what is the time, the interval of time between the Westwood Lodge second hospitalization and the Bournewood Hospital fourth hospitalization?
Well, almost no time. They're both June 2002. So during the month, he's discharged from one hospital, he's admitted to the other.
And what diagnoses, if any, are interposed at that point?
Well, they agree at that point, major depression with psychotic features. They're not saying it's bipolar disorder, they're back to major depression. Then they say psychosis not otherwise specified, which means we don't know if all of the voices and visions and delusions he's experiencing are due just to depression. We think there's something else going on here. And it's an actual diagnosis in here, psychotic disorder not otherwise specified. Like, we don't know exactly what this is, but we know it's a psychotic disorder, but it doesn't fit one of the other 300 words in here. And then they're wondering, because when they write rule out schizophrenia, which the court or jurors or yourself will see on this page, they're saying, let's think about whether this could be schizophrenia. After all, his mom suffered with it, and let's think about that.
And what would the criteria for a schizophrenic diagnosis be?
Well, there are positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia, not meaning good and bad, but ones that are quite active and ones that limit the person in terms of his activity, or her. So, again, people can have voices and visions that they hear. They can experience delusions. These are some of the positive symptoms. They're not positive. They're devastating, but they are ones that happen. They're active symptoms.
And what does the term rule out normally suggest?
Well, rule out means we think that this could be happening, but we don't know enough to write it definitively. So think, it's like telling other doctors who'd read the chart, this could be going on.
And were there any other diagnoses?
Yes. It's a diagnosis that I also made of Mr. Alemany, among others, borderline personality disorder.
And what, when you talk about borderline personality disorder, what are we talking about here?
Well, when we started talking, we talked about how psychiatry divides its diagnoses into Axis 1, major mental illnesses, Axis 2, personality disorders, Axis 3, medical conditions. In that Axis 2 category, personality disorders, one of them is borderline personality disorder. And borderline personality disorder has its own very serious symptoms, but it impedes the way that you relate to yourself and others very substantially. One of the features is that you tend to have very intense, unstable relationships with people. You also can tend to hurt yourself a lot because you can't cope with emotions. So, and we already talked about the fact that Mr. Alemany, in my opinion, is a setup for a personality like this because he's grasping for ways to avoid his underlying trauma, his underlying feelings, how fragmented he is. And so it's convenient, if you want to put it in quotes, for his mind to try to create lots of conflict outside of himself as a distraction. And you can do that in relationships. Also, when he cuts himself, it's not always because a voice is telling him to do that. It could be because he's profoundly upset. He feels mishandled or misunderstood, but he lacks communication tools. And so he does things that are highly unpredictable, like lashing out at himself. But among the other symptoms, in reading from the DSM-5, you'll find transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms.
What do we mean then by the term, what does the DSM mean by the term dissociative symptom?
So dissociative symptoms means essentially leaving yourself. Now this is what we talked about from age 12 at least, when he was, in my opinion, to a reasonable degree of psychiatric certainty, sexually abused rather horrifically. So dissociative disorder is leaving yourself, but now you're not trying to do it, it's just happening. So you're losing memory, for instance, amnesia, or you're losing your sense of self, your identity, such that you may not even remember doing things, or you may adopt another way of being, another personality that you don't even remember. And so that's the notion of dissociation, is essentially like a leaving of yourself. It can be profound and complete, such that you literally would behave in two very different ways at different times, and that's where dissociative identity disorder comes in, what used to be called multiple personality. But it can be much more transient than that. It can be that you have periods that you essentially depart from yourself, much like, by the way, what Mr. Alemany's family, teachers, and caretakers, even at DYS, described. Why is he wandering out of a classroom? What are you doing? I don't know. Leaving home. Where were you? What do you mean, where was I? I just left 10 minutes ago. No, it's been a day and a half, Edwin. Okay? Dissociation is a feature of borderline personality disorder, and they're identifying it in that context. I may describe it a little bit differently when we get to that.
So can borderline personality disorder, even though it's an axis 2 disorder in that multi-axial model of the DSM, can it be a psychotic disease as well?
Dissociation is inherently psychotic.
So
Yeah.
Dissociation is a psychotic feature which can exist in axis 2 disorders as
Absolutely, and none of this is voluntary, and so when these symptoms visit themselves upon someone, people do things that are meant to either further distract them or stop these things, the voices, the visions. And Mr. Alemany obviously stumbled upon cutting himself, eating screws, eating paint and plaster, anything to not be besieged by the very painful psychiatric symptoms that were happening.
And after the Bournewood Hospital 4th hospitalization in June, July of 2002, are there further hospitalizations, sir?
There is a third hospitalization at Westwood Hospital in September of 2002, so 2 months later.
And what, if anything, do you know about that hospitalization?
During that hospitalization during 2002 at Westwood Hospital, that's when he's tried on Geodon, but also he requires...
Geodon is antipsychotic.
An antipsychotic. But also he requires Thorazine injections at times. And I noted that in my report because, having run inpatient psychiatry units myself, they're saying that he got so out of control, either violent or either trying to hurt himself or others, that he needed to be restrained, but tying him down wasn't enough. They needed to chemically restrain him by injecting him with Thorazine.
From the summary, it indicates that this spate of hospitalizations essentially ends in 2002, correct?
Correct.
Well, he's 18 years old in 2002. What has happened at this point?
Well, at that point, Mr. Alemany has aged out, if you will, of the DYS system, the Department of Youth Services system.
Could you say what you precisely mean by aged out?
The Department of Youth Services would not have any further services to provide him. He's now an adult.
And what happens to him at that point, in terms of the medical protocols and treatments?
Well, at that point, the medical protocols and treatments essentially end because there's no supervising authority to deliver them, and as I've already testified, he's not exactly surrounded by people aware that he needs a lot of help. His mom to this day isn't sure he ever needed anything.
So at that point, would it be fair to say that the DYS umbrella over him has ended?
Yes.
He's no longer, their resources are no longer available to be utilized by him?
That's correct.
He's not receiving medications from the placements they were making for him in different hospitals and treatment centers, correct?
Correct.
Now on this chart, it suggests that the next time you got any kind of in-house treatment was at the Suffolk County House of Corrections in 2011, 2012, correct?
Correct.
But would it be fair to say that he was arrested prior to that in a variety of criminal actions and was put in other houses of correction before that?
Yes.
And do you have any current understanding of whether he got any kind of treatment in the different houses, medical, psychiatric treatment in the different houses of correction, 2004, 2007, 2010, 11, when he was sentenced for different periods of time to them for criminal activity?
At various points during his incarcerations, he would need, of course, medications, because even jail isn't really able to contain Mr. Alemany's psychiatric disorders, which is which testifies to how fractured our system is.
And would it be fair to say you were able to review some of the in-house psychiatric treatment at the different houses of correction, the records that you have?
Yes, yes.
And what can you tell us about the kind of treatment he was getting then, the kind of medications he was getting and so forth?
Well, Mr. Alemany, when he's incarcerated, he's still receiving needed medications. They may not be comprehensive, but they do include antipsychotics, mood-stabilizing medicine, and as well as some mood-stabilizing medicine, antipsychotics, and I guess that would be the bulk of, and antidepressants.
So in 2002, he leaves the DYS family, and those medications and those treatments cease, correct?
Correct.
And at various times between 2002 and 2013, he's put back in Suffolk County House of Correction, the Worcester County House of Correction, and for periods of time gets some medications, some treatment, correct?
Correct.
And when he leaves the House of Correction, when his sentence expires, does he still get medication and treatment?
Generally not, because Mr. Alemany doesn't have resources, and he doesn't have a center himself. And so he does what he can to control his symptoms when they're not being controlled by a supervising authority, which is he tries to use alcohol, which will quiet voices and visions to some extent, but it's a devil's bargain because it's going to complicate matters, cause neurological damage when used to excess, could lead to further head trauma. And so he tries alcohol.
When you say tries alcohol, can you describe what his course of alcoholic intake was from his early teens to when he was arrested in 2013?
Yeah, Mr. Alemany is using alcohol more than not in a binge fashion, getting it when he can, drinking with friends, procuring it in any way that he can, using marijuana when he can, anything he can do to try to take the edge off these very severe symptoms.
So would it be fair to say that was his primary source of self-medication during this time period when he wasn't getting psychoactive meds from different hospitals?
I think that the substances were his primary bad source of trying to deal with very severe symptoms, other than another thing he tried to do, which is to go, this sounds mundane, but he tried it. He'd try to go fishing, right? And there was part of him that knew, if I can put myself in a place where there are not people and focus only on one thing, maybe that will reduce these symptoms. This becomes a source of conflict with his girlfriend, by the way, who's like, why are you always going fishing? And why are you always drunk? Well, because I'm always sick, is the answer.
And what is generally the effect of long-term alcohol use on brain function?
Well, number one, long-term alcohol use can certainly impair memory, short-term and long-term.
Is there any greater applicability to that principle between younger people and older people?
Well, we know now that adolescents are particularly vulnerable to substance use and abuse. And there's data now that a single use of marijuana as an adolescent can literally change the anatomy of the brain. So one could imagine that if starting at age 12 you are consistently using alcohol, marijuana, ecstasy, and your friends, if you can find it, Ativan, Xanax, Klonopin, any tranquilizer, anything to bring down
Of major mental illnesses that I believe you're going to opine that he was suffering from during this period are long-term chronic conditions that only deteriorate if they're not treated correctly?
Correct.
And do you feel that happened to him in the years going forward from 2000 to 2013?
Yes. Yes.
And you do hold the opinion he was suffering from some major mental illness in July of 2013, correct?
Correct.
And what were those mental illnesses?
Okay.
And if you can state it in the diagnostic model of the DSM, please. Sure.
So, Axis 1 are those major mental illnesses. I believe that Mr. Alemany suffered with a dissociative disorder and that this had been missed. It would have been a useful way to think about his symptoms. This departing from self, not remembering, that's the hallmark of a dissociative disorder. And unfortunately, there was very little in the way of diagnostic workup that would have been appropriate if Mr. Alemany suffered with that, and the medicines may have been different. Had someone said, I think it's a dissociative disorder, this wandering off, etc., it's all properly thought of under that label. Even though, again, people aren't labels, but identifying that as a problem for him would have been useful. That's number one, as an Axis 1 disorder. But there's a secondary Axis 1 disorder, which is major depression. Very clearly, Mr. Alemany has suffered with chronic, severe, profound major depression. All of his voices, none of them tell him he's a good guy. None of them say, why don't you go and collect your lottery ticket. They're all hypercritical. They're all about darkness. They all tell him to kill himself or others or get people to kill him. Major depression is the second Axis 1 disorder. And there's a third Axis 1 disorder, which is alcohol use disorder. Right? He keeps gravitating toward alcohol as his primary substance to try to cope with these things, and it does him no good, because bad things happen when Mr. Alemany, already hobbled by these other illnesses, adds alcohol to the mix.
And is there any other, on this multi-axial model, are there any other axis disorders, whether it be axis 2, axis of medical disorder, and axis 3 that exist that further define the situation?
Yes, I do think he has an axis 2 disorder. I think some of his symptoms can be described by borderline personality disorder.
And be fair to say that there's a broad continuum of the severity of borderline personality disorder from mild to very severe, correct?
Correct.
Where does he fit into a reasonable degree of medical psychiatric certainty? Where does he fit in the spectrum as far as you're concerned in July of 2013?
I think it's very severe. That's what people are noting. That's why he's cutting himself, why he's eating screws, why his relationships are so fractured. It's one of the reasons why he can't maintain work. He argues with people. People argue with him. He can't seem to get anything done. Well, of course not.
And does that or does that not include the psychotic features of dissociation that you earlier mentioned are part of, can be part of bipolar disorder per the DSM?
So per the DSM-5, it could be that borderline personality disorder itself would bring its own dissociative symptoms. I do think, however, that he has such a level of those symptoms that it's proper to diagnose him with a dissociative disorder on axis 1. But it's also true that he has a personality disorder on axis 2. If I were treating this man, I would not pretend that we are dealing only with a neurologically based condition that has affected his perception and his mood. It has profoundly affected the way he relates to other people, which is not normal.
So on July 23rd and 24th of 2013, when he committed the crimes that he's been charged with committing, do you have an opinion held to a reasonable degree of psychiatric medical certainty as to whether he could substantially appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions, yes or no?
I do,
And
yes.
What is that opinion?
My opinion is that as a result of serious mental illnesses, Mr. Alemany, on the dates you cite, could not appreciate either the wrongfulness of his conduct, nor could he conform his behavior to the requirements of the law.
And you hold both of those opinions to that requisite reasonable degree of medical psychiatric certainty, sir?
Absolutely.
Are there any further reasons you would like to give for that you haven't already mentioned to the jury?
I don't believe so.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Could I take a 2-minute break for water?
Sure. We'll take a short break. We'll give you a bathroom break upstairs.
Thank you so much.
All rise.